year is 369 BCE. A man is fishing in the Pooh River with a bamboo pole when two messengers arrive from the king with a formal offer, Prime Minister of Chu. He doesn't put down his pole. He asks them about a dead tortoise, and his answer would outlast every kingdom that ever employed him. What he understood, and what the modern data now confirms, is that the harder you chase people, money or approval, the further all three move from your reach. The exhaustion of the chase. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that has no name in modern language. It isn't physical tiredness, and it isn't burnout in the clinical sense. It's something older than both of those. The exhaustion of a person who has been performing competence for so long that they've forgotten what it felt like to simply exist without an agenda, who has been adjusting and strategizing and presenting for years, sometimes decades, and who wakes up one morning with the quiet, terrifying suspicion that all of it has been pulling them in exactly the wrong direction. You know the three chases, even if you don't name them that way. They've simply become the water you swim in. You chase approval by monitoring how you're perceived and adjusting your behavior before anyone has asked for the change. You smile faster than you naturally would. You agree before you've thought, and you check your phone after a meeting to see if the message landed correctly. You chase money by treating the hustle as identity rather than as a means, until the work that was supposed to create freedom has become the thing that owns you. The side project becomes the main project, and the main project becomes the only project, and the only project becomes the reason you can't sleep. You chase people by pursuing connection with the intensity of a person who fears its absence, not noticing that the pursuit itself is what creates the distance. The extra text, the strategic availability, and the careful calibration of how much to reveal, and when are all performed not because connection feels good, but because its absence feels like a threat. The numbers aren't subtle. Gallup's most recent data says that 48% of the global workforce reports feeling burned out at work, and 76% of workers say they experience burnout at least sometimes. 52% of burned out employees are actively hunting for a new job while they're falling apart at the one they already have. In North America, more than 70% of employees report moderate to high workplace stress, and only 21% of workers in the United States and Canada believe their employer genuinely cares about their mental health. Teams with high burnout show 18 to 20% lower productivity, and burned out employees are 63% more likely to take a sick day. The chase has become the background radiation of working life, and you don't notice it anymore because it's always there. This isn't a failure of willpower, and it isn't a lack of discipline or a shortage of ambition. It's the predictable result of a strategy that most people never question because it looks like the only responsible way to live. You push harder when things resist, and you try more when the first attempt fails, and you chase what isn't arriving because absence feels like a problem that only effort can solve. You are taught that the responsible thing is to force the outcome, and the forcing has become so automatic that you no longer feel it as force. You feel it as Tuesday. You feel it as the low-grade hum behind every decision, the quiet certainty that if you just pushed a little more, the situation would finally turn. It never turns. It adjusts to your force and requires more. But the chase isn't the solution. The chase is the mechanism that creates the scarcity. The year is 369 BCE, and a man who understands exactly what you're feeling is about to say no to the safest, most powerful job in his world, the turtle in the mud. His name is Zhuangzi, though the world will later call him Master Zhuang. He's a minor official in the Kingdom of Song, and he's fishing in the Pooh River with a bamboo pole when two vice-chancellors arrive from the Prince of Chu. They carry a formal document. We hereby appoint you Prime Minister. He doesn't put down his pole, and he keeps watching the water. Then he asks them a question. He says, "I'm told there's a sacred tortoise that was offered and canonized 3,000 years ago, and it's venerated by the prince, and it's wrapped in silk in a precious shrine on an altar in the temple." He asks what they think. Is it better to give up one's life and leave a sacred shell as an object of cult in a cloud of incense for 3,000 years, or to live as a plain turtle dragging its tail in the mud? The Vice-Chancellor admits the obvious. For the turtle, it's better to live and drag its tail in the mud. Zhuangzi's answer is immediate. Go home and leave me here to drag my tail in the mud. This isn't a man who lacks ambition, and this isn't a man who failed to understand the offer. The Warring States period is the most violent century China has ever seen. 7 kingdoms tear each other apart constantly, and entire cities are emptied, crops are burned, and rivers run red. In this context, a prime ministership isn't a job. It's survival itself, and its power, status, food, safety, and the protection of everyone you love. Refusing it isn't laziness. It's a calculated rejection of a system built on coercion, performance, and the endless maintenance of a position that requires you to become someone else. Zhuangzi didn't refuse the job because he was afraid of work. He refused it because he'd already done the accounting and knew exactly what it would cost. The difference between those two things is everything. What he refused wasn't simply an appointment. He refused the system of chasing that the appointment required, the face to save, the position to defend, and the ritual performance of a self that has something to lose. He refused the endless negotiation with power that turns a human into an instrument of the state. And what he understood about that system is the exact thing that 76% of burned out workers are missing right now. But here's what most people miss about this moment. Zhuangzi wasn't advocating for doing nothing. He was advocating for a different kind of doing entirely. Finding the spaces. Wu Wei isn't the absence of action, it's the absence of forcing. The action is real, the movement is real, and the work is real, but there's no longer a gap between the actor and the action, no longer a self standing behind the movement, watching it, judging it, and trying to control its outcome. Think of it this way. If you have a muddy pond, you can try to clean it by going in and removing mud, piece by piece, with increasing precision and effort, and this is useful. Or you can let it settle, and the settling isn't passivity, it's the recognition that stirring produces the turbidity you're trying to escape. Tea isn't virtue in the moral sense, it's the natural power that emerges when everything false has been stripped away. It's the quality of a thing simply being itself without performance or agenda. A blade finds the joint because it has stopped trying to cut the bone. A river shapes the valley because it has stopped trying to shape itself, and a person speaks plainly because they've stopped trying to be impressive, and who's more credible as a result than anyone in the room. There's a story in the Zhuangzi about a butcher named Cook Ding. He has been butchering oxen for 19 years, and he has never changed his chopper. Other butchers replace theirs every year because they hack through bone and muscle, wearing the blade down against resistance. Cook Ding doesn't hack. He has learned to see the spaces between the joints, the hidden paths where the body naturally opens, and he inserts what he calls his thickless blade into what has room for it. There's space in the joint, but the chopper's edge has no thickness, and if you insert what has no thickness into the space of the joint, there's plenty of room to move. Lord Wenhui watches him work and says he has learned a lesson worth keeping on how to nurture life from a butcher in his art of butchery. This isn't poetry, it's engineering. The butcher hasn't stopped working. He's working more precisely than anyone watching him can comprehend, and he isn't doing less. He has eliminated the wasted effort of pushing where things don't want to go. Zhuangzi called this state the Great Attunement. The modern equivalent is the person who has stopped forcing their career, their relationships, and their self-image into shapes that the situation isn't asking for, and who has discovered that the space they were looking for was already there, hidden inside the structure of the problem. This is the colleague who doesn't attend the unnecessary meeting and is more prepared as a result for the necessary one. This is the partner who doesn't perform reassurance and is more genuinely present as a result. And this is the worker who doesn't tinker with what's already working and has more energy as a result for what's actually broken. Zhuangzi called this freedom within the life world Fang Nei, and the freedom outside it Fang Wai. You don't need to leave your job or your marriage or your city to practice this. You need to find the space inside the joint where your effort isn't creating resistance. The question isn't whether you're working hard enough. The question is whether you're hacking through bone or finding the space. And most people have never asked that question. This isn't passivity and this isn't withdrawal. This is finding the exact place where the joint opens and moving there instead of hacking through the bone. The chopper still moves. It moves more precisely. Here's what this looks like in the 3 places you actually live, so let me be concrete. The 3 traps. The first trap is chasing people. Think about the last time you felt someone pulling away, and your response was to reach harder. More messages, more availability, and more strategic displays of the version of yourself you thought they wanted. The text that's carefully timed not to seem eager, the casual mention of your plans designed to create jealousy, and the offer to help that's really an offer to be noticed. The reaching isn't connection. The reaching is anxiety wearing the mask of effort. Modern psychology calls this anxious attachment, and its core mechanism is exactly what the Taoists described 25 centuries ago. The harder you pursue, the further the other person moves, because your pursuit has become a force they must resist in order to maintain their own shape. You aren't pulling them closer, you're pushing them into a position where their only move is to create distance, and the chase generates the scarcity it fears. The person you're trying to hold on to isn't leaving because you aren't good enough. They're leaving because the force of your holding has made staying feel like suffocation. Sound familiar? Stay with me. The second trap is worse because it's wearing the mask of responsibility. Hustle culture has made the pursuit of wealth into a moral identity, and the numbers are devastating. Gallup says that 48% of the global workforce reports burnout, and that burned out employees are 63% more likely to take sick days. The cost of disengagement globally is $438 billion in lost productivity. More than 70% of North American workers report moderate to high workplace stress, and 52% of burned out employees are actively job hunting while they're still employed. These numbers aren't the result of laziness. They're the result of a culture that treats constant forcing as the only legitimate strategy, that rewards the person who hacks through bone instead of the person who finds the joint. The irony is severe. The chase for security produces the instability it fears. The overtime, the side hustle, and the improvement of every hour create the performance of availability to employers who don't return the loyalty. Your 5 a.m. routine is supposed to create energy, but it actually creates debt. The course that's supposed to create passive income consumes the weekends you were supposed to spend recovering. Only 21% of workers in the United States and Canada believe their employer genuinely cares about their mental health. The rest are performing trust they don't feel in exchange for stability that doesn't arrive. And here's where the story gets stranger. The third trap is chasing approval, and this is the most subtle because it disguises itself as professionalism. You adjust your presentation before the meeting, and you monitor the room for signals that you're landing correctly, and you rewrite the email 3 times, not because the idea is unclear, but because the tone might be too much or not enough. You laugh at the joke that wasn't funny, and you agree with the point you don't believe, and you stay late not because the work requires it, but because leaving early sends a signal you don't want to send. You volunteer for the project you don't have time for, because saying no would require a version of yourself you haven't learned to be. You aren't doing the work, you're doing the performance of a person who deserves to do the work. The exhaustion of this performance is deeper than physical tiredness because it has no clock. It doesn't end when the task ends. It becomes the continuous background cost of simply existing in a room with other people. The Taoist text Liezi contains a chapter attributed to the philosopher Lao Tzu that takes this logic to its extreme. A person shouldn't sacrifice so much as a single hair of his head for the benefit of others, and this sounds like selfishness, and that's the superficial reading. The deeper reading is this: forced sacrifice isn't virtue. It's a violation of natural limit. The person who destroys himself in service of a system that demands his destruction isn't a hero. He's a person who has mistaken coercion for duty. The Taoists didn't praise selfishness. They praised honesty about what a situation actually requires versus what the performance of virtue demands. Liezi himself roamed through the warring states, advising kings and rulers, but his work is distinguished by wit and by its emphasis on using the pattern and cadence of nature as the guide for human conduct. Even in power, he wasn't chasing it. The reversal is the core insight. The chase doesn't merely fail. It actively generates the problem it promises to solve. The harder you pursue connection, the more you create the conditions for isolation. The harder you pursue wealth, the more you create the conditions for exhaustion that costs you the wealth you already have. The harder you pursue approval, the more you create the conditions for a self that no one, including you, can actually locate. Here's where this lands for you, not as a philosophy shift, as an action. One thing to try. This week, identify one conversation, one project, or one relationship where you're currently forcing an outcome that the situation isn't asking for. Not forever. For 48 hours, stop forcing it and watch what moves on its own. The instruction must be specific because letting go is too abstract for a mind that has been trained to chase. So name the forcing behavior precisely. Maybe it's the extra email that strategically reminds someone you exist, or the impulse to improve a process that's already working well enough, or the unsolicited advice you give to prove your value in a conversation. Maybe it's the check-in you perform not because you have new information, but because absence makes you anxious, or the meeting you schedule to move a project forward when the project is actually waiting on someone else's input, and your meeting will only create the illusion of progress. Pick one. Stop it for 48 hours. What to expect is important because your mind will try to tell you that nothing is happening, so the experiment failed. Nothing is what happens first. The system you are pushing has grown accustomed to your force, and without it, the system pauses. This pause isn't failure. This pause is the space where the joint opens. Your anxiety will spike because anxiety is the habit of forcing, and habits don't like being interrupted. Notice the anxiety. Don't act on it. Let it exist without feeding it with the behavior that usually quiets it. Then a small movement that wasn't there before, not a miracle, a slight reorganization. The other person speaks first, or the deadline shifts on its own, or the idea arrives without being chased. The relationship finds a new equilibrium that doesn't require your maintenance, or the project reveals a path you couldn't see while you were pushing. This isn't magic. It's the natural motion of a system that has been allowed to settle, the way a muddy pond becomes clear when you stop stirring it. The clarity was always possible. The stirring was preventing it. You aren't stopping work. You're stopping the wasted effort of pushing where things don't want to go. Cookding didn't put down his chopper. He found the space where the chopper could move without resistance, and the work continued. The work became precise. After 48 hours, you will know something you couldn't have known before. You'll know whether the situation needed your force or simply tolerated it. Most of what we call necessary effort is actually habit wearing the costume of responsibility. The 48-hour stop is how you tell the difference. That's the practice. One place, 48 hours, no forcing. See what remains when the noise stops. The river doesn't choose its banks, plan its course, or accept appointments. It flows, and because it doesn't resist, it endures what nothing else can. Drop a comment with this. Where in your life are you currently forcing something that the situation isn't asking for? I read everyone and subscribe because we go this deep every week.